Liani, you're on.
Hi all, I'd just like to welcome you to this webinar session, and we'd like to send a big thank you to everyone who's attended, and a big thank you to our guest speaker, Dr. Adele. Dr. Adele qualified as a veterinarian in 2009 and has joined us today to speak to us about dehorning. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We really like to see any questions and we're willing to answer anything. And then as well, all proceeds from this and from any donations go to Wild Hearts, and we'll be putting the webinar link to donations up soon. So without anything more to say, we'd like to just welcome Dr. Adele.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for hosting me. I wish you guys have a glass of wine or a beer or a cup of coffee with you, because this talk is going to be very relaxed and not too scientific on a Friday night, especially on a long weekend. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Let me share the screen with you. Okay, I'm hoping that's working. Right, so the talk tonight is going to be about rhino dehorning. We're going to talk a little bit about why we do it, some of the complications we experience, and so on. I am a wildlife veterinarian at the Faculty of Veterinary Science. I'm also doing my PhD on dehorning. So I'll present some data that we've gathered and also some retrospective stuff that has been done. So the first question we probably have to ask is, what is dehorning? Just to get everyone on the same page. So it's obviously the removal of the horns from the rhino. The method we use is a non-surgical method, because we do get a form of surgical dehorning, which we're not going to discuss. There has to be no damage to the germinal layer, or that's what we try to achieve. In other words, it's also painless and it doesn't affect future growth. It is also a legal method of removing the horns, because in contrast to legal, there would be poaching, which is obviously illegal. And we consider dehorning to be ethical. It doesn't have really a lot of welfare issues. So why do we dehorn rhinos? There are two reasons. First, it's a source or a potential source of income. I'm not going to discuss this in too much detail, because you will have a talk tomorrow on the economics and potential legal sale of rhino horn. And then secondly, as an anti-poaching intervention, and that is what we're going to discuss tonight. So these are pictures you guys have seen, and it's the unfortunate reality of the situation in South Africa and in Southern Africa for that matter. We are dealing here with two problems. One, a dead rhino cow. So that's a crime scene that has to be dealt with. And secondly, this cow had a little calf. So there's an orphan, it's probably dehydrated, stressed, and we now have to try and intervene in that matter and do rehabilitation. You're going to talk about that as well. So two problems that the veterinarian has to deal with in this one photo. I mean, if we can avoid that, that would be ideal, right? So just to bring you up to speed, rhinos are poached for their horns, and pretty much only for the horn. There are some other organs and so on that's used in the muti trade and in the Far East, but mostly they just want the horn. It's used as medicines and other therapeutics in the Far East, traditional Chinese medicine and so forth. But increasingly these days, it's used as ornaments and as status symbols. The most of the rhino that are poached are dead. Yes, we do have a few survivors, and that is a whole different topic. But for most of them, they are dead. So we lose them. We lose the genetics. We lose the reproductive potential, and so forth. So this is a situation which, if we can avoid it, we need to. Okay, so there are a few critical questions we need to ask ourselves about dehorning. One, is it effective in preventing poaching or reducing poaching, and to what degree? And is it sustainable? Secondly, what are the biological consequences of dehorning? So this would be social, reproductive, etc. consequences. You will note throughout the presentation that I have a lot of horned rhino, and that's how I prefer to see them, as we all do. I wish the day comes that we never have to dehorn a rhino again. But for now, I think this is our solution, and I'll show you why I think so. So first, how do we dehorn a rhino? Okay, so if you look at this picture, I don't know if my cursor will show, but the yellow line represents the skull. Okay, the red line is the growth plate or the germinal layer. The skull and the germinal layer we don't want to cut. Then we cut into living tissue. So we want to make those cuts basically on the black line away from living tissue. We cannot cut flush to the face because that would be for the front one, that orange line. If we cut flush to that or close to that, we cut into the germinal layer and perhaps even into bone if we cut that deep. So there are two methods we mostly use: the square cut method for dehorning, and then the ZIM method. And I'll show you both now. The square cut method basically is just a square cut, as the name implies, and on those black cutting lines I showed you. There's an example of one. These are not my photos because we don't do the square cut, so I don't have my own photos to share with you, but there's one from my website. And then there's a modification of that where we just use a grinder to round the edges. The ZIM method removes pretty much all the horn we possibly can without cutting into living tissue. And it would look something like that. So much more rounded appearance. So what is the difference between the two, apart from visually looking different and perhaps having less horn, as one could deduct from that? So the square cut is relatively simple. It's just 2 square cuts we make and then we're done. It's mostly done by using a reciprocating saw, sometimes a chainsaw, and it's probably the most feasible option for horn farming. The ZIM method, in contrast, requires more skill because we're using a chainsaw, we're doing fine cuts, and it takes a bit of practice, and it's mostly used for conservation actions. So why the contrast, and why not use the one for the other? Because the answer is that the one does remove a lot more horn. How much, you may ask? So in a population of, this was a population of 14 rhino, we dehorned all 14 of them. 5 of them were calves under 2 years of age, so we didn't include them in this data. So here you can see 9 animals, 4 bulls, 5 cows, ranging from just over 3 years to 17 odd years old. We did the square cut, weighed the horn, and then we further went on and did the ZIM method and pretty much weighed all that horn separate. So we removed more than 1 kilogram of horn from those rhino on average. Big bulls, 3 kilograms. And we've done big bulls of about 27, 28 years old, where we've removed an additional 5 kilograms of horn. So that's a lot of horn that you leave behind doing the square cut. So for that reason, we assume at this stage that the ZIM method would be better for a conservation approach to protect rhino against poaching, simply because you don't leave that much horn on the rhino, and that could be an incentive for poachers. Okay, so how do we do the ZIM method? I'm going to run through this quickly. First, we remove the front horn with a chainsaw, then the back horn doing the square cut. Sometimes, depending, we sometimes remove the back horn first, but it doesn't really matter. And then we end up with something like that. So that's the square cut. Then we take the chainsaw and trim away all those sides, like in blocks. That's where the bulk of the horn and the base is. So we remove that. You can see this rhino, we still need to do the back horn, but we've started trimming the front horn. And then you sit with something like that. Now there's still a little bit of horn left on this rhino that we can remove. So we take the chainsaw again and we do fine trimming with the chainsaw. And this is where it really takes some skill to use the chainsaw. But you just take away little bits by little bits because you don't want to cut into living tissue. And then you end up with something like that. Now that's a pretty average, actually a poor example, because you can see you can probably take a bit more horn away, but that's just with a chainsaw. So compare it to the little picture in the corner, you can see there's quite a bit of a difference. And then this procedure really takes shape when we use a grinder with a tungsten hoof disc, and we take away all those edges of horn. And the idea here is to create a sleek profile of horn that fits or conforms to the rest of the head. And then you end up with something like that. You can see there's very little horn left on that rhino, and it's got a nice sleek profile. Okay. So then the question really is dehorning effective in reducing or preventing poaching? Because this, in the end, is what we're trying to achieve. So I'll present some data to you. Between January 2014 and December 2016, that's a 3-year period, we dehorned 1,109 rhino, most of which were white rhino, small percentage black rhino, using the ZIM method. So we didn't do square cut on these. We dehorned a total of 1,600 times. So some of these rhinos were done twice, some of them even 3 times. Depending on the risk that they were under. So, but 1,109 individual rhino. Of those 1,109, only 10 were poached. That is a poaching rate of less than 1%. So the question really is that a good rate? Because it's not zero. Obviously, we would love a 0% rate, but that is not the reality. We lost some, and we need to determine, is that good or bad? Okay, so the question really is, how does this compare to the square cut? And that answer I can't give you now, because that data isn't very common, and part of my PhD will try to answer that. Perhaps there is no difference between doing a square cut and the ZIM method, and then we may say, all right, let's just do square cuts for anti-poaching. It takes much less time, about 10 minutes less per rhino. And if you add up all the rhino being done throughout the day, that would be 1 or 2 hours extra you've got to dehorn more rhino. So as a cost saving and a time saving, perhaps a square cut is a viable alternative. And that's why we need to look at it. But how does dehorning in general compare to non-dehorned rhinos? So at that stage, the stats in South Africa said we had about 20,000 rhino. We know now that that was probably not the truth. There's a lot less, was a lot less, even less now. But let's work on 20,000 rhinos, because that's the figure we've got. 3,000 of those were dehorned. That's both square cut and the method. So that leaves us with 17,000 horned rhino, of which we know 1,000 was poached at the peak of the poaching. That is a poaching rate of more than 5%. So we can argue that a horned rhino has got a 5 times higher risk of being poached. We know that now that there's probably at that stage there was only about 12,000 rhino and not 20,000. So that leaves us with 1,000 out of 9,000 poached. That's closer to 10%, more than 10%, in fact. And in places like the Kruger National Park, where there's a high risk of poaching, it's probably even more than that. So some lessons we've learned. You need to dehorn all the rhinos in a population for it to have the best effect. You need to follow up dehorning. You can't do it once and then expect poaching to stay away. Ideally, every 18 months, but certainly no longer than 24-month intervals. And in high-risk areas, we dehorn every 12 months, and you could do it more frequently if the risk is super high. And remember, dehorning is not a silver bullet. You still need other anti-poaching activities, patrols, good fencing, a whole bunch of high-tech stuff being used these days, drones, shot detection, all those sort of things. All that adds up. What you're trying to create is a situation with a lot of risk for the poacher of being shot or killed with very little reward on the rhino. As soon as it swings, the poaching will start. Okay, next, what are the biological effects or consequences of dehorning? There are three key issues we need to address: the social structure and behavior, reproduction and calf survival, and then the direct effect of dehorning on the horns itself and potential future regrowth. So social structure, here you see a picture of a bunch of rhino, a crash of rhino that we've dehorned about 2 years prior. In this particular herd, farm, reserve, no difference in social behavior was noted. And this corresponds very well to the recent research being done on rhino and the historic dehorning being done in the early 90s in Zimbabwe, where they noticed no effect on social structure and behavior. It, however, may be of concern when you do strategic dehorning. So strategic dehorning is where you only dehorn certain rhino in a population or in certain areas within a protected area, for example. And an example of this will be the Kruger National Park, which in the end of 2019 started dehorning, and they did strategic dehorning of cows with calves in high-risk areas. Okay, so there you may have an impact on social structure because you are putting some animals perhaps to a disadvantage of dehorning them. However, some data, and there's quite a lot to support this, show that despite being dehorned, some mature bulls, territorial bulls, was able to defend their territory against horned bulls. So the fight could go either way. So at this stage, we probably don't need to worry about this. What is the effect on reproduction and calf survival? So one thing we need to ask is, does it affect pregnancy? We immobilize these animals, they are stressed through helicopter chases, etc. I'll show you a video of that later. Do they abort from that? And the answer is quite simply no. We've done lots of them. We don't see any reduction in calf, or we don't see an increase in calf mortality or abortion, both close to partus. Okay, so there's no effect. This picture, you can see there are 2 cows with calves. The one is just around 6 months old, the other one about 2 months old. These cows were dehorned 8 months before this. So they were pregnant, and they calved down quite easily. And some rhinos we've even dehorned twice within their pregnancy to dehorn them, and they didn't abort. So I think we don't need to worry about this. Okay, what about conception, the effect of mating and so forth? You can see these rhino, they on their horns still have this white brownish color, so they've recently been dehorned. These guys we dehorned 2 days for the bull, 3 days for the cow prior to this incident. So it seems they're not really too bothered about having a horn or not. They can still mate, they conceive without issues. Then the very interesting part is, what is the effect of dehorning on in terms of predators and calf recruitment? So there is a lot of conflicting reports on this, and the literature dating back to the early 90s is also not very clear on this. Some say it's got no effect, and others say it does have an effect. I think what we need to understand is that black rhinos and white rhinos are not immune to predation. Okay, they are caught by predators, and whether they've got a horn or not, this is true. Black rhino, probably due to their smaller size and temperament, that they often attack predators, thus making them a little bit more vulnerable. The black rhino are more prone to predation than white rhino. Black rhino calves are taken more than white rhino, probably because of the same reasons. The cow attacks and then the calf is taken. So these are not rare events, they happen. So does dehorning increase their risk to predation? That is the real question. What we know is in black rhinos, the size of the horn has got no influence on the behavior of the cow towards predators. That behavior is more related to the size of the calf. Black rhino cows with small calves would run away, whereas slightly bigger calves, they would tend to attack predators. And the same could be said towards humans. So would that increase their risk to poaching? Probably. What we do know, however, is that what we see on the ground does not support the literature that says they are more at risk of predation. The populations that are being dehorned, those populations are growing. And I think that is the key. But this does require some long-term ecological studies because it's probably one of those things that will always be questioned. What can we do in terms of this? What we do know is the degree of predation, especially from spotted hyena on black rhino especially, is linked more to the density of hyenas and the size of the hyena clans. So in areas where we think that may be a problem, the answer is reduce hyena numbers, or either by culling, which would be controversial, or by relocation, or simply do not dehorn rhinos with small calves in areas where there's high hyena densities. That, however, would probably result to the death due to poaching. So I wouldn't advise that. Okay, in terms of horn, there you can see this is about a regrowth of 2.5 years after being dehorned and what we call a fissure, a crack in the horn. And this could be from various reasons, but the most common reason we see this is poor cutting technique. All right, so the person did a bad job in dehorning. Okay. It's not always because of the person's skill. These things happen. That rhino on the far left, I personally dehorned it, cut into the germinal layer in the central part, as well as in the peripheral part. Okay, it happens. Every rhino's germinal layer has got a slightly different height, if I can put it that way. So sometimes you cut and you think it's the perfect height, and you cut into living tissue. It's not our intent, but it happens. Is that a big problem? Well, yes, it can result in those lesions like on the right. The middle photo will be a horn abscess. Mostly they are sterile. And that's probably from poor cutting technique. So this we didn't see in the live rhino. The rhino before dehorning, and then as we made the cut, we saw the abscess. Are these problems significant? In my opinion, no. They are correctable within time, pretty much like a damaged hoof on a horse or cattle or so on. So with time, you can cut these things out. And you'll see on the far right, that is one that had a problem. We dehorned it, and now if we dehorn it again at that stage, it will be a normal germinal layer growing out. So within a year or two, you can correct this. So I think it's not something to be concerned about. And we're seeing about less than 0.5% of rhinos that we dehorn with complications like this. All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to try share a video so you can now put everything this together and what goes into a dehorning operation, and then we'll take some questions. Give me a second. I hope it works.
We're at Redfly Nature Reserve today doing rhino dehorning. We dehorned these rhino about a year ago. This is a follow-up dehorning, and we're really just trimming it basically to take away that temptation from the poachers. And then hopefully with all the security measures in place, you have a situation where we've got a lot of risk for very little reward. We've dehorned pretty much the whole population. We've got one rhino left to do. White rhino are quite sensitive to the drugs, so we take a lot of caution when immobilizing them. We've done over 1,400 rhino in the past 4 years, and we've lost very few to poaching. We do lose to poaching. One cannot say dehorning is an absolute fail-proof method, but it definitely is one of the better alternatives to rhino poaching at this stage. These sort of operations cost a lot of money. We've got the drugs, veterinary costs, helicopters, fuel, and it's only made possible by organizations like ERP and Flying for Freedom South Africa, who's contributing the helicopter and fuel, and I thank those parties involved for that.
Just 1 second. I know this is so rude that I'm on my phone right now.
Okay. I hope that worked.
It was perfect. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks. I'm happy. All right, let's take some questions.
There's a few questions in the chat. Leonie, are you gonna thank you?
Yes. Okay, doctor, we have a question here from Dahlia Salman. She says, hello, Dr. Dow. Does dehorning only benefit the human, or is it their positive part for the beautiful animal? And also, what is the future for our beautiful rhinos in Africa? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that's the complex one. Does it only benefit humans? I guess that's the first part. Well, the dehorning itself is not supposed to benefit humans. So we are doing it as an anti-poaching strategy. So the idea is to protect rhino from poaching. That's the main purpose. Can it benefit humans? Yes, obviously. So we'll benefit from the idea and of having rhinos. So I mean, I would be I would be a very sad person, to be honest, if there were no rhinos on this planet. Okay, so it makes me happy to see rhinos, and that's what I'm trying to achieve for future generations. So I think simply the emotional effect of having rhinos is important. Secondly, how does it benefit people as well? There's a financial benefit potentially. Okay, so there is simply due to tourism. Okay, so if we don't have rhinos, we lose the tourism part. But the sale of rhino horn potentially could massively contribute to people's pockets directly. So a personal financial gain. But I think personally, it can also contribute to rhino conservation. If we apply the money right, we could probably protect rhino through legal sale of horn. But I don't want to go too much into that. That's a topic for Vian tomorrow. What was the other second part of the question?
Okay, the second part is, what is the future of our rhinos in Africa?
Well, I mean that's a great question that I can't answer because currently the future is bleak. We are losing more rhino than we are breeding rhino, or there's more being killed due to poaching than that are born. Okay, whether they are captive or free ranging, we have a negative growth of rhino, and that's a problem. Currently, I think we're still fine with numbers. The numbers are much less than what is out in the media, that I can tell you. I can't tell you what they are, but they are much less. But we're still not at the point where they're going to go extinct this year, for example. But if we continue at this rate, we will be in deep trouble soon. Within the next decade, we'll probably lose the rhino if we continue. So we have to do something about it. So I'm quite optimistic, and I think there's a good future for them. The reality is, if we cannot protect something as big and majestic as a rhino, then we probably have failed dismally as humans, because how are we going to protect some random bat or a rodent that is endangered, or a lizard, a snake, stuff that people sort of don't care about? If we fail to protect rhinos, how will we protect the rest of nature? That's the question. Okay, is there more questions?
Thank you, Dr. Adele. I think some of the questions were answered already in your presentation. So we also want to thank Kevin for their question, which I believe was answered in your presentation. But Dahlia also has a second question, a second part to her question, where she asks, how long does it take for a rhino horn to regrow? Is the horn able to regrow after dehorning? And how long does a rhino take to heal post-operation, post-procedure?
All right, yes. So let's just be clear on that. So this is a non-surgical dehorning, meaning we try not to cut into living tissue. Okay, I showed you the photos of where we have done that by accident, but a perfect dehorning, as you've seen in some of the clips in the video, you don't see any blood. In other words, it's like trimming your nails. Okay, you're not cutting into living tissue. There's no blood, and it's painless. But your nails regrow. Horse hooves continually grow, and it's a similar thing with rhino horns. So you dehorn it, and immediately it starts growing. It's a continual process, okay? So how quick does it grow? It's roughly about, and it varies between populations, genetics, nutrition, all those things, but we can probably work on a figure of about 7 to 8 centimeters on average per year. And that would differ also. Young rhinos, their horn grows quicker than older rhinos, similar to young people's nails growing quicker. So there's a few factors that determine that. But it continues to grow, and that's why we need to follow up dehorning every 18 to 24 months, because in a year's time, there will be a block of horn that is potentially an attractant to poachers. I think that's it.
All right, and so I'm sure Dahlia is very thankful for your answers, and she has another comment here where she's just saying that she says it's wildlife is too beautiful and humans are affecting wildlife rather than letting the animals be wild. But I think what she's trying to say is that what they're trying to say is that it's such a pity that this is the situation that we're stuck with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the first time you dehorn a rhino, it's quite a emotional thing, because I mean, a rhino without a horn is not a rhino, really. But the reality is, it's a life-saving intervention. And now, you know, if I do it, I feel like, okay, I'm actually giving them a chance. It's never nice. I can't wait for the day that we don't have to do this anymore. Not because there's no rhinos left, but because we've succeeded in finding some other sustainable solution to save them. What that is, I don't have the answer. I don't know if there's an answer even. But dehorning is it buys us time. at this point. It's working, and until we get something else.
Thank you, Doctor. We have a question here from Philip. If there is horn damage and bleeding, do you give some form of antibiotics in the field?
Yeah, so you would have seen on those photos, on the video, and some of the photos, the rhino is covered in it's got a purple horn. So that is a wound spray that we put on. Even if we don't nick the germinal layer, we still put it on. And the reason for that is the horn has got a bit of an oily substance that attracts or may attract flies. So putting that spray on, it's got it's twofold. One, to keep flies away. It's got a fly repellent in it. And secondly, it's got a antibiotic in it. Very much like mercurochrome or Jensen violet that you would put on your skin if you've got a minor wound. We never give them systemic antibiotics. It's not needed. In fact, to really get a suitable dose into a rhino is almost impossible, and it's not going to reach that part of the horn in most instances. So we never give them systemic antibiotics, and it's never been needed. Purely once or twice off topical treatment, and those horns grow back normally in future. Next question.
All right, and then we have another question from Kevin, his second question, but we like the questions. He says, have you seen different regrowth rates in different biomes or vegetation types? I know you've maybe mentioned this, but it's important to ask, I think.
Yeah, certainly it will have an effect. We haven't looked at that data yet for regrowth in various areas. That's something we will do at some point, but there certainly is. I think supplementary feeding certainly improves horn growth. So smaller reserves and farms that feed, especially during winter time, a concentrated pellet, those horns tend to grow quite quickly. So certainly a horn farmer, if we can call them that, they would supplementary feed, and you will see higher growth rates there. So that is to be expected. If you're taking your multivitamin every day, your hair and your nails are going to grow much quicker than someone who's malnourished.
All right, and then following on from the sort of growth rate question, Innocent asks, is there anything that can be done to stop the horn from growing at all from a young age, like destroying the germinal layer, like what's done to cattle calves?
Yes, okay, so this type of dehorning we're doing is different to dehorning in cattle, where we're burning the germinal layer to prevent any future growth. So that question has been asked quite a bit, and that's why I specifically stated this is non-surgical dehorning. So the question is, can we somehow dehorn a rhino so it never grows a horn again? I think that is a viable question. Once we know the answers, that the horn has got pretty much no value for a rhino. Okay, so if we know it's got zero biological consequences, and we're not at that point yet. So can we do that in a rhino? Yes, I think it's possible. You can destroy the germinal layer completely, either by surgical removal or perhaps even by hot iron burning or freeze burning. So those things are potential research topics for the future. And I know some people are interested in looking at that. Okay.
Now, this is a question also from Innocent. Will dehorning at a younger age probably not have will have an effect on a social behavior or sexual behavior?
Yeah, look, I mean, those sort of answers can only come with long-term studies. And unfortunately, rhinos are animals that take a long time to become sexually mature. They've got a long gestation period. So it will take 10, 15 years to give a concrete answer on that. But what I can tell you, what we've seen, is it has no effect. We've dehorned calves. The youngest calves we dehorn is 6 months old, because then they just have a little stub there And we just feel we're knocking out the mother anyway. So we just take the grinder and smooth that. A year later, they've got a nice piece of horn again because they've got a fast growth rate, and we dehorn them. So I've dehorned calves from about 6 months old, and some of them are about close to 5, 6 years now. So they will only now start becoming sexually active and mature. So we can really only answer that in a few years' time. But my gut feeling is that it'll probably have no effect because they're still rhinos, and they see the other rhinos mate and behave like rhinos.
I have a question on that. So when a calf starts with its horn, it's very squishy, like it's very soft. Is there a different method when you dehorn then the calves at 6 months?
I wouldn't call it squishy. Initially, when they're born, they don't have a horn. So it takes a few months for that horn to grow. And once the little stub starts, it feels like horn. Yes, it's much softer than a horn of a 30-year-old bull. But the procedure is the same. So once it's tall enough, we'll use the chainsaw. If it's just a small little nub, stub, or whatever, call it what you want, then we just flatten it down with the angle grinder.
Right, thank you, Doctor. So I have a comment and a question from Bossy, and he says, I logged on a bit late, enjoyed the talk. We use the square cut on the reserves I help out. We have lower casualties than on other reserves, just for interest, but I have been asked to assist in multiple animals where animals had abscesses or blood coming from the horns where grinders were used. Perhaps better training for vets who do want to use the Zim method. Banned to think that some animals walk in the greater Kruger with an encapsulated abscess or on its nose for 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, certainly. I agree. I think it takes a bit of skill to do the method properly. We've done loads, so the more you do, the better you get, just like anything else. But it's a matter of being comfortable with the chainsaw, and it's a matter of practice. And we advise guys to practice on. Don't do the first one on a rhino. If you've never handled the chainsaw, cut wood as a start, and then get a nice block around piece of hardwood, and then try and simulate a dehorning on that. So obviously, just like with any veterinary procedure, it takes some practice and skill. In terms of the comment on 18 to 24 months with an encapsulated abscess, I am not too worried about that, because these are not real abscesses. They're not affecting the soft tissue. Some of them may, but then it's the exception. Most of it is just a seroma within the horn. It's at the bottom towards the skull and the germinal layer. It's lined by more horny tissue, and thus the animal doesn't experience any pain. It can't become systemic and so forth. So I think the risk of that is far outweighed by the risk of being poached. But if you can protect rhino with a square cut, and that's what I said, that's what we need to investigate, is if a square cut is a feasible option, and it may be, then it may be the way to go.
And so I have a different question from James Larkin, and he says, have you thought about alternative horn devaluation techniques? A bit off the dehorning topic.
Yeah, so there are a few alternatives. The one is the infusion of poisons into the horn. The other is infusion of dyes into the horn. And then there is a combination of those two. Unfortunately, the published results is not very positive for that method. Perhaps if you're trying to limit the use of rhino horn as medicine, it makes sense. Who's going to use horn as medicine if it's poisoned? The question is, does the end user really know that it's been poisoned? And I think the answer there is no, because the middlemen aren't going to tell them. But one of the problems is that we're seeing an increase in the use of rhino horn for ornaments and status symbols. So people want a nice big rhino horn on their table somewhere in a high-rise building in China. So the reality is that they don't care if there's poison in there as long as it's a nice horn specimen. So perhaps that's why one of the reasons why that's not being very successful. The other option is the infusion of radioisotopes into the horn. And the idea with that is, yes, they could still kill a rhino and poach it, take the horn, but the idea is to pick up the horns at airports and places of entry into countries. You know, if you put something like uranium or something that is highly flagged by countries, they would not let that horn into their country. So I think that's a better alternative. But yeah, that's not my field of study, and it's very new research being done, so we'll have to keep an eye on that.
All right, thank you very much. We do have more questions, but I have a personal question quickly that's kind of similar. How can DNA be used to trace rhino horns, and can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So DNA is obviously the ultimate in identification, the ultimate tool in identification. Every rhino in this country that is immobilized has to be identified. That's a law. So you have to take DNA samples and send it to the veterinary genetics laboratory, which run that database. So every rhino that's been immobilized legally has been DNA sampled. So we can take DNA samples from horn. So it is possible to trace back a horn that was found in Vietnam or anywhere across the world to a specific rhino, if that rhino has been previously sampled. In the Kruger National Park, for example, too many rhino to sample all of them. If it's one that's never been immobilized, you can't trace it back. You can probably use DNA to some degree to say it's probably from that population, but our rhino is so closely related that that'll be a tricky one. But we can potentially identify legally harvested horn from illegally harvested or poached rhino, yes.
All right, thank you. And I just have a question here from Prince Mutasa. He says, on average, how long is the dehorning procedure? And he says also, so currently, what happens to the horn you guys dehorn? Is it disposed or stored?
Okay, so once the rhino is immobilized and we start measuring where to cut and so on, I do the Zim method in less than 10 minutes to do that. So it's very quick. If you're just doing a square cut with the reciprocating saw, it'll be half the time, few minutes, 5 minutes max. The entire procedure from darting the rhino until finish, it ranges, but depending on how quick you get the rhino down and it's safe, the anesthetic is safe and so on, we aim to do a rhino every 20 to 30 minutes in larger conservation areas. So we can do, depends, but 10 to 30 rhino on a day, depending on how many and frequently you find them. What was the other part?
The other part, what happens to the horn? Is it stored or disposed?
Yeah. So by law in this country, the horn has to be stored at this point in time, and that's the responsibility of depending on where the rhinos are, but basically the custodians or owners of the rhino. So it normally goes into safe vaults and it's stored there after being DNA sampled, etc.
We have a question here from Mika, also regarding what legislation is needed to be able to dehorn a rhino, the legal requirements.
Yeah, so I can speak from a South African point of view. The rhinos will have to be legally owned as a start. So there will be a TOPS permit for a possession permit for the owner or custodians of the rhinos. Then the veterinarian immobilizing the rhino, he or she needs a top standing permit to work with top species, which rhinos are. And then to dehorn rhino, we need an additional dehorning permit. And that normally is either done by the veterinarian or the owners or managers of those rhinos. And then you would need a storage permit for the horns as well. So there's a lot of legislation involved.
And then we have another question from an anonymous attendee, and they say, "Good day, Doctor. Do you think that dehorning every 18 months is efficient? I visited the Pilanesberg Game Reserve at the beginning of the year, and while I was there, a cow that was dehorned a bit less than a year ago prior was poached, which makes me believe that dehorning every 18 months isn't enough."
Yeah, so as mentioned, depending on the risk, you need to assess each situation. We've had rhinos poached at 2.5 years, some at 2, and in high-risk areas, we dehorn every 12 months. So we've got a couple of populations that are, there's a lot of incursions. We dehorn every 12 months, and we haven't lost rhino for a couple of years. So it's a risk equals reward situation. If the poachers know they'll get a little bit of horn and they're not going to get shot for doing it, then they're going to poach it. But if there's a risk of being killed for just a small piece of horn, they may think twice and go somewhere else where there is horns.
Okay, here's a question from Dr. Devandra. If by mistake we overcut the horn, is it lethal in free-range rhinos?
By overcut, I'm assuming you're cutting into living tissue. I assume that's what the question is about. No, we've never lost a rhino due to cutting into living tissue. You have to be negligent to be truthful to go that far to cause mortality. You can imagine a lot of rhino that survive being shot or they were poached by chemical immobilization. They have half their faces hacked off, like almost in that picture I showed you, and they survive. That's a huge problem to deal with. But dehorning, you're not going to kill a rhino. We've never lost one to that.
An interesting statement from James Larkin. So it's in his field of study, but he doesn't want to hijack your presentation. But he says here, you can also identify where rhinos come from based on stable isotopic ratios.
Yeah, interesting. I need to make contact with James about that isotope study. James, please send me a mail. Yes, so assuming what he's saying about the isotopes is that depending on what isotopes you use, you can identify where the horn comes from. But I mean, if we've placed the isotopes in the rhino horn, then we would have sampled them for DNA as well. So we've got two potential tracing mechanisms.
Okay, Doctor, I have his email address here, so I will send it on to you.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrew?
And then we just have one question here from Kevin, one comment from Kevin, not in the question and answer session, before we finish the last few questions. He says, very informative chat. I certainly feel we should be working towards regular destruction of germinal layer in every free-roaming rhino calf in the Kruger National Park at a very young age, the same as dehorning younger calves ASAP, sooner rather than later. The sooner we develop an effective minimal trauma method to do this, the better off we'll be. So that's just a comment. I don't know.
Yeah,
if there's a question in there.
Personally, I don't agree with that at this stage. I think if we're going the route of permanent dehorning, it should be a small nucleus population in an area that we know we can protect, because there will be a lot of effort, money, and time going into doing that. So we don't want to do it in a place where there's a risk of them being shot anyway. So it has to be in an intensive protection zone. And I think we need to know a little bit more about what the biological consequences of dehorning is. We've got a good idea of that. It's probably minimal, if probably not nothing, but we need to be able to put our heads on a block and say, we know it's got no effect. And we can remember those rhinos are going to have no horns for the rest of their lives, 30, 40 odd years. But yeah, agree, we need to look into that.
All right. So Dahlia has asked another question, and she says, what biosecurity is used in wildlife? And I imagine this is particularly to the rhino dehorning procedure.
Pure biosecurity. I mean, now we're drifting to diseases. So potentially spreading disease between populations. Yes, there's a risk. Some of our rhino populations are under quarantine for tuberculosis, and we certainly don't want to spread tuberculosis to other disease-free herds. So as with any biosecurity measure is, if you worked with a diseased herd, you need to take the precautions not to spread disease. Spreading a disease like TB through a rhino horn or dehorning procedure is probably very low, although we have not really measured it. The tool we use, both tools, the chainsaw and the grinder, they do generate heat, and probably on cutting, you do cauterize every potential pathogen if it was on the horn. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, although we never work in TB herds and then follow on to disease-free herds, for example.
Doctor, I have a question from Kevin again. Have you noticed any increased vulnerability in cows being unable to defend their calves against predators, elephants, conflict following dehorning?
I think we've answered that. And I mean, the answer is no. There's no overwhelming evidence that points towards dehorned animals being more at risk.
And then we have an anonymous question as well, saying, what is the mortality rate due to complications of anesthetics used in immobilization? I imagine this is whether you've had any mortalities while immobilizing a rhino for a dehorning procedure.
Yes.
And is
yes.
that a risk factor?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's something we need to ask, because if that was a higher risk, then certainly the procedure would not be justified. So luckily, I mean, even if we go back to the first dehornings in 1989 in Namibia, then following 1991 in Zimbabwe, and from there on thousands of rhinos that's been immobilized for dehornings, the mortality rate is really low. So maybe we've been lucky. We know rhino are very sensitive to the drugs. We've lost way less than 1% of white rhino during dehorning due to capture complications. Much less. It's like less than 0.3% of rhino. We've lost 2 out of those 1,400 rhino. Now we're over 1,500 already. Only 2 due to capture complications. And normally there's some underlying problem. They would have died at some point in any way. So I think it's a small risk. And that risk is probably going to get lower in time, because we're advancing in terms of rhino immobilization and anesthesia due to great work done by a lot of people. But one of my mentors and PhD supervisors, Dr. Prof. Leith Meyer, they're doing fantastic work on the pharmacology on capture. But in general, we aim for a mortality rate of less than 2% in all captures. That is rhino, antelope, mass capture, darting, etc. So that's our goal. If we go above 2%, we need to question what went wrong.
We did do an interview with with Prof. Leith Meyer last year. If anybody wants to go visit our Facebook page, or even the University of Pretoria Science YouTube channel, we have it there. And then more about the immobilization drugs was also talked about with him. And then tomorrow, Emma will also address some of the drugs that she used. But we have a question here from Bossy Bosov. Should we, while we do horn trimmings, also start collecting DNA to make sure that with the fast shrinking populations, due to poaching, we get a database to prevent inbreeding in the future when we do translocations?
Well, I'm not sure where the person is from, but if it's in South Africa, certainly if you immobilize a rhino legally, you're supposed to take DNA. So those samples are collected and they are banked at the VGL. So I'm sure they probably have enough samples to look at genetic diversity and to say, right, if we end up in a situation where we only have 50 rhino left, which ones are most suitable to breed with who, that situation. So we're a long way from that. But the reality is, if you think back in time, our founder population of southern white rhino comes from a small population in Shushluwe. Some say 30 individuals, some say 90, some say 150, whatever the case. That's a small starting or founder population. So we've already had one genetic bottleneck. We probably don't want to risk taking another one.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think we have come to the end of the questions. Leonie, I don't know if you saw on your side, but I think we had a question from Audrey, but it disappeared on my side. I can't find it anymore. But I did have one personal question, and that is that if you stop dehorning, is the rhino able to wear the horn back to its original conical shape when it regrows, or does it often regrow with a sort of twist or a turn to it?
Yes, so rhinos' horns are pretty much the shape they are, conical, for probably two reasons. One, the central part of the horn is harder than the periphery, and then two, they rub it against hard objects. So the softer horn is obviously rubbed away with time, and they get this nice shape. And you will see horn shapes of various horn shapes in rhino, especially black rhino can have an interesting range of shapes. So initially, after dehorning, the horn sort of grows a little bit cylindrical, but with time they wear it away, and it takes many years before you'll see a normal shaped rhino horn. I can tell you some of the populations that we've dehorned a couple of years ago and have not followed up. So it's about 5 years now. They still don't have normal pointy horns. So it'll take probably, in my guess, 7 to 8 years to get a normal shaped rhino horn after dehorning. Initially, they'll be cylindrical, rounded at the edges, but they'll shape them and shave them into a pointy horn with time.
Thank you very much. I think that's really interesting, and I think that Leonie and I are really impressed with your knowledge. But we have found this last question, and Audrey says, "Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Adel. There are a number of organizations and veterinarians performing these techniques. The legalities of what to do regarding dehorning are covered in the legislation, but not on how to do it. Would you support the formation of norms and standards for rhino dehorning? Rhino dehorning procedures to ensure the standards are met to ensure safety first and that specific protocols are followed?"
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've got myself and a few co-workers have gone and taught a lot of veterinarians how to dehorn. Since 2013, we've been doing that. So it's been a while now. And some of those vets have gone on to dehorn hundreds of rhinos, which is fantastic. So I think the training part is very important because it's certainly not something you can just do if you've never seen it. It's not a purely veterinary procedure because it's not surgical. So it's often done. We often train rangers how to do it. So the vet can rather monitor the animals, the anesthesia, which is a veterinary procedure. So it's it will probably be a little bit difficult to put into norms and standards. But I think there is maybe some value in that in future. I think as long as we can back ourselves with some data, And I think there's one or two few things we still need to figure out. But yeah, I think in future it can probably be part of the norms and standards of keeping rhino, etc.
Dr. Jock, thank you so much for that talk. It was very interesting, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. I would just like to thank everyone for attending it as well. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And then before we end for tonight, I would just like to take the opportunity to ask everyone again to please consider donating to Wild Hearts Rehab Center by following the link in the chat or scanning the QR code on the screen. They are an amazing organization that support orphaned rhinos that are victims of poaching. And if you are interested to show your support by buying any of our merchandise, then you are encouraged to please follow the link in the chat to our social media accounts, where you can find links to the order forms. And if you have any issues, you can message us. So yes, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope to see you tomorrow for the following talks, and good night.
Thank you. Keep well. Bye.